Picture this: rain hammering down on the dark streets of Portland, Oregon. The year is 1947. Through the mist and the neon glow of waterfront bars, a black Cadillac rolls silently past the docks where longshoremen unload crates that customs will never inspect. Behind the tinted windows sits a man in a tailored suit, his face hidden in shadow, a cigarette burning between his fingers. His name isn't Capone, it isn't Luciano, it isn't Gotti. His name is Vincent DeGrasso, and if you've never heard of him, that's exactly how he wanted it. While the East Coast mob families fought bloody wars that filled newspaper headlines, while Chicago gangsters became Hollywood legends, Vincent DeGrasso built an... Picture this: rain hammering down on the dark streets of Portland, Oregon. The year is 1947. Through the mist and the neon glow of waterfront bars, a black Cadillac rolls silently past the docks where longshoremen unload crates that customs will never inspect. Behind the tinted windows sits a man in a tailored suit, his face hidden in shadow, a cigarette burning between his fingers. His name isn't Capone, it isn't Luciano, it isn't Gotti. His name is Vincent DeGrasso, and if you've never heard of him, that's exactly how he wanted it. While the East Coast mob families fought bloody wars that filled newspaper headlines, while Chicago gangsters became Hollywood legends, Vincent DeGrasso built an empire in the Pacific Northwest that operated in perfect silence. No flashy murders, no public spectacles, just power, control, and millions of dollars flowing through the rainy streets of Oregon and Washington like the Columbia River itself. This is the story of America's most successful unknown mobster, a man who controlled politicians, corrupted lawmen, and ran everything from gambling to labor unions to the very liquor that filled glasses in speakeasies from Seattle to San Francisco. A man who understood that true power doesn't announce itself, it whispers. And when Vincent DeGrasso whispered, the entire Northwest listened. Before we dive into this forgotten chapter of American crime history, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you listening to this at midnight, unable to sleep, drawn to these tales from the shadows? Or maybe it's a quiet Sunday afternoon and you're diving deep into the underworld of forgotten criminals. Let me know down below. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to take you on a journey into the darkest corners of history that the textbooks deliberately forgot. Now, let's begin where all great crime stories begin.
Not with violence, not with power, but with a child who learned very early that the world doesn't give you anything. You have to take it. The winter of 1903 was particularly brutal in Brooklyn's Williamsburg neighborhood. Snow piled against tenement buildings where Italian immigrants crowded into apartments designed for half their number. In one of these cramped spaces, surrounded by the smell of coal fires and boiling pasta, Maria DeGrasso gave birth to her third son, They named him Vincenzo, though everyone would later call him Vincent, or more often, Vin. Vincent's father, Giuseppe DeGrasso, worked the docks like most men in their neighborhood. 14-hour days breaking his back for pennies, while dock bosses skimmed profits and politicians looked the other way. Giuseppe was a good man, a hard man, a man who believed that honest work and faith in God would eventually reward his family with the American dream everyone talked about. Vincent's mother shared this faith. They raised their sons to respect authority, attend church, and never cause trouble. But Vincent watched his father come home each night, hands bleeding, back bent, pockets nearly empty. He watched his mother stretch a single chicken across 3 meals, watering down the soup until it was barely more than flavored water. He watched his older brothers follow Giuseppe to those same docks, accepting the same poverty, the same back-breaking labor, the same impossible dream. And Vincent decided very early that he would never be like them. He was a peculiar child, quiet, observant. While other boys played stickball in the streets, Vincent sat on stoops and watched. He watched the neighborhood bookies collecting money. He watched the local black hand enforcers shaking down shopkeepers. He watched the beat cops walking past illegal gambling dens, their pockets clearly heavier after each pass.
He watched the neighborhood capo, Don Salvatore Maranzano, drive past in his expensive car, and he saw how everyone stopped what they were doing to nod respectfully, to tip their caps, to acknowledge real power. Vincent learned his first important lesson before he turned 10. The world is divided into 2 types of people: those who follow the rules and stay poor, and those who make their own rules and take what they want. By age 12, Vincent was running numbers for local bookies, not because he needed to, his family would have been horrified, but because he wanted to understand how the system worked. He was good at math, better than his teachers at the overcrowded public school. He could calculate odds in his head, remember complex betting patterns, and he never made mistakes with money. The bookies loved him. More importantly, they talked freely around him, assuming he was just another dumb kid grateful for pocket change. But Vincent wasn't just another kid. He was absorbing everything: how the betting networks operated, who paid protection to whom, which cops were on the take and for how much, where the money flowed and who controlled each stream. He filled notebooks with observations, teaching himself a criminal education more valuable than anything school offered. In 1917, when Vincent was 14, his father Giuseppe died. Not dramatically, not tragically, just worn out, body broken from years of dock work, lungs destroyed by cold dust and damp air. He was 42 years old. At the funeral, Vincent stood dry-eyed while his mother and brothers sobbed. He felt nothing except a cold certainty that he would never, ever end up like Giuseppe DeGrasso. His oldest brother Antonio wanted Vincent to quit school and come work the docks. Maria begged Vincent to stay in school, to become a clerk or maybe even a lawyer. Vincent did neither.
Instead, He approached Don Maranzano directly, something no teenage boy would dare to do, and asked for a real job. Maranzano was intrigued by the kid's audacity. Most boys his age were terrified of men like him, but this skinny 14-year-old walked right up with complete confidence and explained in careful detail how the Don's numbers operation could be more efficient with better organization. He pointed out weaknesses in the collection system. He identified runners who were skimming. He offered solutions to problems Maranzano didn't even know he had. The Don hired him on the spot. For the next 3 years, Vincent worked his way through Maranzano's organization. He started as a runner, then became a collector, then supervised other runners. He was never the muscle. Vincent was too smart for that. He understood that the men who did the violence were expendable. The men who counted the money were valuable. The men who thought several steps ahead were indispensable. And Vincent was always thinking several steps ahead. He noticed something that would shape his entire criminal career. The older bosses were focused entirely on New York. The 5 boroughs were carved up between rival families, fighting over the same territory like dogs over scraps. Everyone wanted to be a bigger fish in the same overcrowded pond. But Vincent saw a bigger opportunity. America was vast. Cities were growing everywhere, from the Midwest to the West Coast. New territories that had no established families, no entrenched power structures, no one to say, "This is ours." In 1920, the 18th Amendment changed everything. Prohibition arrived like a gift from God to organized crime. Suddenly, the entire country was thirsty for illegal alcohol, and the families that could supply it would become wealthy beyond imagination.
While most mobsters saw Prohibition as a chance to expand their New York operations, Vincent saw it as something else entirely. His ticket out. He began researching Western states obsessively. He studied shipping routes, railroad lines, population growth, and political corruption levels. He learned everything he could about cities most New Yorkers couldn't even find on a map. And he kept coming back to one region, the Pacific Northwest. Oregon and Washington were perfect. Major ports for Canadian liquor, growing populations in cities like Portland and Seattle, timber money flowing like water, labor unions ready for corruption, and most importantly, no established mob presence. No Italians, no Irish, no one. It was virgin territory for a man smart enough to claim it. In 1922, at just 19 years old, Vincent DeGrasso approached Don Maranzano with a proposal. He wanted permission to go west and establish operations in Oregon. He would send back a percentage of profits, but would operate independently. Most bosses would have laughed at a teenager making such a request, but Maranzano had watched Vincent for 5 years. He knew the kid was special, and the Don was smart enough to recognize that having a friendly operation on the West Coast could be valuable for everyone. Maranzano gave his blessing with one condition. Vincent would need to prove himself capable first. He needed to show he could handle the violence and pressure that came with building something from nothing. So he sent Vincent to work for the next year under Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared enforcers in New York, learning the brutal side of the business. That year changed Vincent forever. He witnessed murders. He participated in beatings. He learned how to make people afraid, how to break resistance, how to destroy anyone who stood in his way. But more importantly, he learned something crucial. Violence should be a tool used precisely and privately, not a spectacle.
Anastasia loved violence for its own sake. Vincent saw it as simply one more form of leverage, to be applied when necessary and never when it wasn't. By 1923, Vincent DeGrasso was ready. He said goodbye to his mother, who cried and begged him not to go west. He promised his brothers he would send money, which he did faithfully for the rest of their lives. And then, with $2,000 in his pocket, a Colt 45 under his jacket, and a head full of carefully laid plans, he boarded a train heading northwest. The journey took 5 days. As the train rolled through state after state, leaving the crowded East Coast behind, Vincent watched America unfold through the window. Vast spaces, growing cities, opportunity. While other passengers saw scenery, Vincent saw potential. Every city was a market. Every rail line was a supply route. Every politician was someone who could be bought. When the train finally pulled into Portland's Union Station on a gray October morning, Vincent stepped onto the platform and breathed in the damp, cool air. Rain was falling, as it would be for most of his time in Oregon. He stood there for a moment, just 20 years old, unknown, unconnected, with nothing but intelligence and ambition. And as he walked out of that train station into the misty Portland streets, Vincent DeGrasso smiled, because he understood something that would make him rich beyond measure. In a city where no one knew his name, he could become anyone he wanted to be. In a region with no established power, he could build his own empire from the ground up. The Forgotten Mobster's reign was about to begin, and for the next 3 decades, the Pacific Northwest would never be the same.
Portland in 1923 was a city caught between its past and future. The timber industry still drove the economy, filling the air with the smell of fresh-cut wood and the sound of saws. The Willamette River flowed through the city's heart, its docks busy with ships from around the world. Downtown streets bustled with legitimate business during the day, but at night, a different economy emerged. Speakeasies hidden behind false storefronts, illegal gambling in basement poker rooms, prostitution in the restricted vice district near the waterfront. All of it loosely controlled by local criminals with no real organization, no vision, and no idea what was about to hit them. Vincent DeGrasso spent his first 3 months in Portland doing something that would define his entire criminal career: watching and learning. While other criminals might have immediately tried to establish dominance, Vincent became invisible. He took a cheap room in a boarding house. He got a job as a clerk in a shipping company, giving him legitimate employment and valuable intelligence about port operations. And every night, he visited a different establishment, learning the landscape of Portland's underworld. What he discovered was exactly what he'd hoped for: chaos masquerading as order. The illegal liquor trade was controlled by a loose coalition of bootleggers with no central authority. They competed against each other, driving prices down and drawing police attention. The gambling operations were similarly fragmented, each small-time operator running their own game with no coordination. Prostitution was managed by individual madams fighting over territory. And most importantly, there was no one figure everyone feared, no one boss everyone answered to. It was perfect. Vincent also discovered the key to any successful criminal operation: corrupt officials. Portland's political machine was already well-oiled with bribery, but it was disorganized corruption.
Beat cops took payoffs from individual speakeasy owners. City councilmen accepted money from various gambling dens. The police chief looked the other way for the right price. But no one had systematized it. No one had created a centralized corruption structure that would protect all criminal operations equally. Vincent saw the opportunity immediately. He could become the middleman between criminals and officials. He could organize both sides, creating efficiency and protection that everyone would be willing to pay for. He just needed capital and credibility. For capital, Vincent did something brilliant and dangerous. He didn't try to shake down existing operations or steal from other criminals. Instead, he targeted a completely different source: wealthy individuals who wanted illegal liquor but didn't want to deal with dangerous bootleggers. He created Portland's first private supply service for high-quality Canadian whiskey, catering exclusively to businessmen, lawyers, doctors, and politicians who could afford premium prices. Vincent made personal deliveries, always well-dressed, always polite, always discreet. He provided genuine quality product, something rare in the bootlegging trade, where most operators diluted their liquor or sold rotgut that could blind customers. His prices were higher, but his clients knew exactly what they were getting. Within 6 months, Vincent had built a loyal clientele of Portland's elite, including several judges, the deputy mayor, prominent attorneys, and multiple police captains. This was genius for 2 reasons. First, it generated substantial income without stepping on any existing criminal operations. Second, and more importantly, it gave Vincent direct connections to the exact people who could protect larger operations in the future.
When he eventually needed a judge to dismiss charges, or a police captain to ignore a warehouse full of liquor, or a politician to block an investigation, he already had relationships with these men. They knew him as Vincent, the polite, reliable young man who brought them excellent whiskey and never caused problems. By early 1924, Vincent was ready to make his first major move. He identified the biggest bootlegger in Portland, a man named Jack O'Reilly, who controlled roughly 40.
This was brilliant because Oregon's entire economy ran on timber. Trucks crossed the border constantly, and customs agents couldn't possibly inspect every load of logs. The liquor arrived in Portland safely and cheaply, giving Vincent a huge competitive advantage. By summer of 1924, O'Reilly was hemorrhaging money, while Vincent's operation was growing rapidly. O'Reilly tried to figure out who was behind his problems, but Vincent had been so careful that no one connected the disruptions to the polite young man who sold premium whiskey to Portland's elite. When Vincent finally made contact, it was calculated perfectly. O'Reilly was struggling to pay his protection money to corrupt cops. His suppliers were demanding higher prices, and several of his major customers had switched to Vincent's superior product. Vincent walked into one of O'Reilly's illegal saloons and asked to speak with him privately. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Vincent laid everything out with brutal honesty. He explained that he had been systematically destroying O'Reilly's operation for 6 months and could continue until O'Reilly was completely out of business. He could easily take over O'Reilly's entire market share. But Vincent didn't want to destroy O'Reilly. He wanted to offer him a partnership. This was Vincent's second stroke of genius. Instead of making an enemy out of Portland's most established bootlegger, he made him an ally. Vincent proposed a simple arrangement. They would merge operations. Vincent would handle supply, smuggling, and political connections. O'Reilly would handle street-level distribution and enforcement. They would split profits 50-50 for the first year, then renegotiate based on performance. O'Reilly was smart enough to recognize that Vincent wasn't making an offer out of kindness. The young man had proven he could destroy O'Reilly's operation whenever he wanted.
The partnership was a way for O'Reilly to maintain income and dignity while accepting the reality that Vincent was going to control Portland's bootlegging either way. They shook hands that night, and the DeGrasso-O'Reilly organization was born. Within a year, they controlled 70% of Portland's illegal liquor trade. Vincent's Canadian connections provided steady, high-quality supply. O'Reilly's distribution network and muscle kept competitors in line, and Vincent's relationships with corrupt officials provided protection that made their operation nearly untouchable. But Vincent wasn't satisfied with just Portland. He saw the entire Pacific Northwest as his territory, and he began expanding methodically. He sent trusted men to establish operations in Eugene, Salem, and smaller Oregon cities. Each location followed the same pattern: establish supply lines, corrupt local officials, eliminate or absorb competition, install reliable managers. By 1926, the DeGrasso organization controlled most of Oregon's bootlegging. Vincent moved into his first mansion in Portland's West Hills, drove a new car every year, wore custom-tailored suits, and had enough legitimate business fronts that most people believed he was simply a successful entrepreneur. He invested in restaurants, hotels, shipping companies, and timber operations, using these businesses both to launder money and to establish himself as a respectable member of Portland's business community. Then Vincent set his sights on Seattle. Seattle was a bigger prize and a bigger challenge. The city already had established criminal operations run by men who wouldn't welcome an outsider from Portland. But Vincent had learned patience and strategy. He didn't charge in trying to take over. Instead, he did exactly what he'd done in Portland. He watched, learned, and found the angles no one else saw. Seattle's underground was controlled by several competing factions.
Roy Olmsted, a former cop turned bootlegger, ran the biggest operation. Chinese tongs controlled gambling and opium. Corrupt cops were split between various payoffs, and several smaller operators fought over scraps. Vincent identified the same problem he'd found in Portland: no centralization, no organization, too much competition. So he made the same solution. He would become the organizer, the systematizer, the man who could offer cooperation instead of competition. But Seattle required a different approach than Portland. These weren't small-time operators who could be easily intimidated or impressed. These were established criminals who had been running operations for years. Vincent needed leverage that went beyond just superior supply lines. He found that leverage in an unlikely place: labor unions. Seattle's economy ran on docks, and docks meant unions. The longshoremen's unions controlled who worked, who struck, and who could effectively shut down the entire city's waterfront. Vincent realized that whoever controlled the unions effectively controlled Seattle's economy. So Vincent began systematically corrupting union leadership. He offered bribes to union bosses. He provided services, women, gambling opportunities. He helped them skim from union pension funds. He arranged for their competitors to have accidents. Slowly, carefully, Vincent inserted his people into positions of power within Seattle's dock unions. By 1927, Vincent could shut down Seattle's waterfront with a phone call. He could make sure certain ships were unloaded first. He could guarantee labor peace or create crippling strikes. And he used this power not to dominate the Seattle underworld directly, but to make himself invaluable to everyone in it. He approached Roy Olmsted and the other major Seattle criminals with a proposition. Vincent didn't want to compete with them.
He wanted to provide services they all needed: reliable supply, union control, political protection, and coordination that would maximize everyone's profits. In exchange, they would pay Vincent a percentage and acknowledge his authority to settle disputes. Some agreed immediately. Some resisted until Vincent demonstrated his power by shutting down their operations with strategic dock strikes or tipping police to their warehouses. But eventually, every major criminal in Seattle accepted that Vincent DeGrasso was now a power that couldn't be ignored. By 1928, just 5 years after arriving in Portland as an unknown 20-year-old, Vincent DeGrasso controlled criminal operations throughout Oregon and Washington. His organization smuggled millions of dollars worth of liquor across the Canadian border. He had corrupt officials on payroll from Portland to Seattle. He controlled key labor unions that could make or break businesses. He owned legitimate companies that generated both money and respectability. And almost no one outside the Pacific Northwest had ever heard of him. This anonymity was exactly what Vincent wanted. While Al Capone made headlines in Chicago and Lucky Luciano fought public wars in New York, Vincent operated in the shadows. No newspaper profiles, no public violence, no showing off, just quiet, systematic control over an entire region. The Forgotten Empire was built. Now Vincent would spend the next decade strengthening it, expanding it, and making himself the most powerful criminal west of the Mississippi that America had never heard of.
By 1930, Vincent DeGrasso had achieved something remarkable in the American underworld. He had created a criminal empire that operated with almost corporate efficiency. While East Coast mobsters were fighting bloody wars that filled newspapers with corpses and headlines, Vincent's Northwest operation ran so smoothly that most people didn't even realize it existed. His organization now employed over 200 people directly and controlled the incomes of thousands more. He had captains running operations in Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, Spokane, Eugene, and smaller cities throughout Oregon and Washington. Each captain ran their territory with significant autonomy, but everyone understood the organizational structure. Vincent was the boss, his word was law, and anyone who forgot this learned painful lessons. But what made Vincent different from most mob bosses was how rarely those painful lessons became necessary. He didn't rule through constant violence and fear. He ruled through making people prosperous. His philosophy was simple. Everyone in the organization should be making enough money that betraying Vincent would be stupid. Loyalty built on profit was more reliable than loyalty built on terror. His bootlegging operation had evolved into a sophisticated international business. Vincent had relationships with distillers in Canada, Scotland, and even France. Premium liquor flowed across the Canadian border in logging trucks, fishing boats, and trains. He had customs agents on payroll at 3 different border crossings. He had warehouses disguised as legitimate businesses throughout the Northwest, and he had a distribution network that could get any type of alcohol to any location within 48 hours. The quality of Vincent's product was legendary. While most bootleggers sold rot gut that could blind customers or diluted whiskey that barely qualified as alcohol, Vincent's organization provided genuine, high-quality liquor.
Speakeasy owners knew that buying from DeGrasso meant their customers would be satisfied and safe. This reputation allowed Vincent to charge premium prices while maintaining complete market dominance. But bootlegging was just one piece of Vincent's empire. He understood something that many criminals didn't. Diversification was protection. If one revenue stream dried up, you needed others. So Vincent expanded into every vice and several legitimate businesses. Gambling became a major profit center. Vincent didn't run cheap street corner craps games. He operated high-end card rooms and casinos that catered to wealthy businessmen and visiting politicians. These establishments were hidden behind legitimate fronts, speakeasies in the front, elegant gambling parlors in the back, where men in expensive suits could play poker with stakes that would bankrupt ordinary workers. Vincent took a percentage of every pot, and on a good night, his gambling operations generated more profit than bootlegging. He also recognized the value of controlling information. Vincent established himself as the premier bookie in the Northwest, handling bets on everything from boxing matches to horse races to baseball games. His organization took bets from thousands of people across Oregon and Washington. This gave Vincent two advantages: substantial profits and valuable intelligence about who owed money and might be desperate enough to be corrupted. Prostitution was another revenue stream, though Vincent handled it differently than most criminals. He didn't run cheap streetwalkers. He established high-end modeling agencies and escort services that provided beautiful women to wealthy clients. Politicians, businessmen, visiting executives all paid premium prices for companionship and discretion.
Vincent guaranteed that privacy would be maintained, which made his services especially popular with married men who couldn't afford scandals. Vincent also understood that the real power came from controlling labor. His initial move into Seattle's dock unions had taught him that unions were power, so he systematically expanded his influence into other unions throughout the Northwest. Teamsters, warehouse workers, hotel employees, restaurant workers. In each case, Vincent used the same approach: bribe union leadership, place his people in key positions, use the unions both for power and profit. Once he controlled a union, Vincent could do several valuable things. He could skim from union pension funds and dues. He could guarantee labor peace for businesses that paid him protection money. He could create strikes that destroyed competitors. He could ensure that only friendly companies got union labor. The unions gave Vincent influence over the legitimate economy that was worth more than his criminal operations. His infiltration of labor unions also gave Vincent something equally valuable: political power. Union bosses delivered votes. In the 1930s, unions could swing elections, and Vincent effectively controlled many of the biggest unions in Oregon and Washington. This meant politicians needed Vincent's approval to win elections, and politicians who owed their positions to Vincent were politicians who voted the way Vincent wanted. By the early 1930s, Vincent had cultivated relationships with virtually every important politician in the Pacific Northwest. The mayor of Portland attended his dinner parties. The governor of Oregon called him for advice. Seattle city councilmen came to Vincent asking for campaign contributions, and Vincent gave generously, always in ways that couldn't be traced back to criminal activity. This political influence provided layers of protection that made Vincent's organization nearly untouchable.
When federal agents occasionally showed interest in investigating Northwest bootlegging, Vincent's political friends made sure those investigations went nowhere. When local police got too aggressive, the mayor or police chief would receive calls from important people suggesting they focus on different priorities. When prosecutors considered bringing charges, judges who owed their positions to Vincent's union support would dismiss cases on technicalities. Vincent had built a system where criminal activity, legitimate business, union control, and political corruption all reinforced each other. Money from bootlegging financed union bribes. Union power delivered political influence. Political protection allowed criminal operations to flourish. Profits from all activities were laundered through legitimate businesses. It was a perfect circular system that grew stronger every year. The end of Prohibition in 1933 barely hurt Vincent's organization. While many bootleggers went out of business when liquor became legal, Vincent simply adapted. He already owned several legitimate businesses that could easily obtain liquor licenses. His speakeasies became legal bars and restaurants overnight. He continued importing premium Canadian whiskey, now legally, and sold it at legitimate prices while still maintaining his edge through established distribution networks. Losing bootlegging profits meant Vincent expanded other operations. Gambling became more important. His union control deepened. He moved into loan sharking, providing money to desperate people at enormous interest rates. He established protection rackets, not through violence, but through offering services that businesses genuinely wanted: labor peace, theft prevention, and problem solving that police couldn't or wouldn't provide. The 1930s were Vincent DeGrasso's golden years. His personal wealth grew into millions, though almost no one knew because he was careful about displaying it.
He lived in a mansion in Portland's West Hills, but it wasn't the biggest mansion. He drove expensive cars, but not the most expensive. He wore tailored suits, but nothing flashy. He could have lived like a Hollywood gangster, but Vincent understood that invisibility was more valuable than celebrity. His personal life reflected the same careful balance. Vincent married in 1932 a beautiful woman named Catherine Russo from a respectable Italian-American family in Seattle. Catherine knew nothing about her husband's criminal activities. As far as she understood, Vincent was a successful businessman who owned restaurants, hotels, and import-export companies. She hosted dinner parties for Portland's elite, attended charity functions, and raised their 2 daughters in complete innocence of how their comfortable life was funded. Vincent maintained this separation religiously. His family never met his criminal associates. His home was a sanctuary where business was never discussed. Catherine and his daughters lived in a bubble of respectability, while Vincent operated his empire through offices, meetings in restaurants, and conversations in the backs of his legitimate businesses. This double life required extraordinary discipline. Vincent essentially played 2 completely different roles. At home and in public, he was Vincent DeGrasso, respected businessman and community leader who donated to charities and attended church every Sunday. In private meetings with his captains, he was the boss who made decisions about illegal operations worth millions of dollars. Very few people understood that these were the same person. The police knew, of course, or at least suspected, but knowing and proving were different things. Vincent was so careful about insulating himself from direct criminal activity that prosecutors could never build cases against him. He never personally touched drugs, never personally met with corrupt officials, never personally carried out violence.
He communicated through intermediaries, gave orders in vague terms, and maintained plausible deniability about everything. Federal authorities tried several times to investigate Vincent during the 1930s. Each investigation went nowhere. Witnesses refused to talk or suddenly forgot important details. Records disappeared. Police reports were lost. Prosecutors found themselves transferred to different cases. The few times charges were actually filed, judges dismissed them for lack of evidence or on procedural grounds. Vincent's protection system was so thorough that he seemed almost untouchable. But Vincent never allowed himself to feel invincible. He had watched too many mobsters fall because they got arrogant, because they started believing their own mythology. Vincent knew that power was temporary and that maintaining an empire required constant vigilance. So he was always careful, always prepared for threats, always looking several moves ahead. His caution would serve him well, because storm clouds were gathering that would test Vincent's empire in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. The late 1930s brought new challenges: increased federal attention to organized crime, competition from younger criminals who didn't respect old arrangements, and political changes that threatened his carefully built corruption networks. And beyond the horizon, a world war was approaching,
that would transform America and create both opportunities and dangers for a forgotten mobster who had built his empire in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest.
December 7th, 1941, changed everything. Though at first, Vincent didn't realize how much. He was having Sunday breakfast with Catherine and his daughters when the news came over the radio. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. America was suddenly at war, and the comfortable world Vincent had built was about to be shaken to its foundations. World War II transformed the Pacific Northwest overnight. Portland and Seattle became critical military ports. Shipyards expanded massively to build warships and transport vessels. Boeing in Seattle ramped up airplane production. Thousands of soldiers passed through Northwest ports heading to the Pacific Theater. The population exploded as workers poured in from across the country to fill defense industry jobs. Suddenly, sleepy Portland and Seattle became boom towns. For most Americans, the war meant sacrifice and rationing. For Vincent DeGrasso, it meant opportunity. Military contracts were worth billions of dollars, and those contracts required labor. Vincent controlled the unions that supplied that labor. Defense contractors needed to keep workers happy and production running smoothly. Vincent could provide both, or create crippling problems. This gave him leverage over some of the biggest companies in America. He played it brilliantly. Vincent positioned himself as a problem solver for desperate defense contractors. When Boeing needed to prevent strikes that could delay critical airplane production, they came to Vincent. When Kaiser shipyards faced labor disputes that threatened warship construction schedules, they negotiated with Vincent. He wasn't extorting anyone, not exactly. He was providing valuable services that these companies genuinely needed. Labor peace, efficient production, no disruptions. And they paid him handsomely for these services. Vincent also recognized that wartime meant shortages, and shortages meant black markets. Rationing created demand for everything from gasoline to meat to nylon stockings.
Vincent's smuggling networks, built during Prohibition, could easily be repurposed for wartime black market goods. Canadian suppliers provided products unavailable in rationed America. Vincent's distribution network moved these goods to eager customers throughout the Northwest. He was careful to avoid anything that could be considered unpatriotic. Vincent didn't smuggle military supplies or materials needed for the war effort. He focused on consumer goods that didn't hurt the war, but that people desperately wanted. Steaks for wealthy businessmen, cigarettes for workers, gasoline for important people who needed to travel, luxury items for black market stores that catered to those who could afford premium prices. The wartime boom also meant legitimate business opportunities. Vincent invested heavily in restaurants and hotels near military bases and defense plants. These establishments catered to soldiers on leave and defense workers with paychecks burning holes in their pockets. The profits were enormous and completely legal. Vincent's legitimate business empire expanded rapidly during the war years. But the war also brought new challenges. Federal authorities became more aggressive about organized crime, partly because they were worried about mob influence in defense industries. The FBI, which had previously focused mostly on bank robbers and kidnappers, started paying more attention to organized crime figures. Director J. Edgar Hoover, under pressure to show he was contributing to the war effort, began investigating potential mob connections to labor unions that controlled defense production. Vincent suddenly found himself of interest to the FBI. Agents began asking questions about his businesses, his associates, his sources of income. They interviewed people who worked for him, searched for weaknesses in his organization, looked for anything that could connect him to illegal activities. This was dangerous in new ways. Local cops could be bought. State prosecutors could be influenced, but federal agents were harder to corrupt and more determined. Vincent needed to adapt his approach for this new threat.
he did so characteristically by becoming even more legitimate in appearance. Vincent distanced himself from obvious criminal activities. He installed additional layers of insulation between himself and any illegal operations. His captains handled the day-to-day criminal business, while Vincent focused publicly on his legitimate enterprises. He donated to war bond drives. He attended patriotic rallies. He made sure his restaurants gave discounts to servicemen. He cultivated an image as a successful businessman supporting America's war effort. When FBI agents questioned him, Vincent was polite, cooperative, and provided detailed records of his legitimate businesses. When they asked about his associates, Vincent expressed shock that men he knew socially might be involved in illegal activities. When they pressed him about union connections, Vincent explained that he merely had friends in labor leadership and sometimes helped mediate disputes. He gave them nothing useful while appearing completely transparent. The FBI investigation continued for 2 years and ultimately went nowhere. They couldn't prove Vincent was involved in anything illegal. They knew he was. They suspected his organization controlled significant criminal operations, but suspicion wasn't proof. Eventually, with the war demanding their attention elsewhere, the investigation was quietly closed. Vincent had survived federal scrutiny, but the experience taught him an important lesson. The old ways of operating were becoming more dangerous. America was changing. Federal law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated and powerful.
The cozy relationships with local politicians that had protected him for 20 years were less reliable when federal agents got involved. He needed to evolve or risk eventually being destroyed. So Vincent began transforming his organization. He gradually reduced direct involvement in obviously illegal activities like gambling and prostitution. Instead, he focused on the gray areas: union control, legitimate businesses with illegal side operations, political influence that was corrupt but hard to prove. He moved away from being a traditional mob boss and toward being something new: a businessman who happened to use criminal methods but operated mostly within legal structures. This transformation accelerated after the war ended. By 1946, Vincent's organization looked very different than it had in the 1930s. He still controlled unions, but now through complex networks of intermediaries that made his influence hard to trace. He still took illegal gambling profits, but through legitimate businesses that happened to have backrooms. He still corrupted politicians, but through campaign contributions and favors that technically weren't crimes. Vincent was pioneering something that wouldn't have a name for decades. He was essentially creating the modern organized crime model, where illegal operations are hidden within legitimate business structures and direct violence is minimized in favor of economic and political power. The post-war years also brought generational changes in his organization. The men who had built the empire with Vincent during the 1920s and 1930s were aging or dead. Vincent himself was in his 40s now, no longer the young hustler from Brooklyn, but an established power broker. He began promoting younger men, a new generation of criminals who understood the changing landscape. But this generational transition created new problems. Younger criminals were ambitious and impatient. They didn't remember the careful building that had created the empire.
They wanted to expand faster, make more money, be more aggressive. Vincent found himself constantly reining in younger captains who wanted to take risks he considered unnecessary. One captain in particular became a problem: Tony Marcello, a sharp young man who ran Seattle operations. Marcello was making enormous profits, but drawing too much attention. He was flashy, drove expensive cars, wore jewelry, dated movie starlets visiting Seattle. He was everything Vincent had spent decades not being. And Marcello was starting to question why he should give Vincent such a large percentage of Seattle profits when he was doing all the work. The situation came to a head in 1947. Marcello approached Vincent with a proposition. He wanted to become a partner rather than a subordinate. He wanted Seattle to be his territory, with Vincent getting a smaller percentage. Essentially, Marcello wanted independence while still using Vincent's political protection and union connections. Vincent listened politely, then said no. The empire worked because it was unified, because everyone understood the hierarchy, because Vincent's word was final. Making Marcello a partner would encourage every other captain to demand the same. It would fracture the organization Vincent had spent 25 years building. Marcello made the mistake of pressing his case. He pointed out that he was generating millions in profits. He suggested that times were changing and old bosses needed to recognize new realities. He implied, not quite directly but clearly enough, that Vincent was getting old and maybe losing touch with how modern criminal operations should work. It was a fatal miscalculation. Vincent let Marcello leave the meeting thinking he would consider the proposition. Then he moved with the cold efficiency he had learned from Albert Anastasia 25 years earlier. Within a week, federal agents received anonymous tips about Marcello's operations. His gambling establishments were raided.
His union connections were exposed in newspaper articles. His political protectors suddenly found themselves unable to help due to new investigations. Marcello's entire Seattle empire collapsed around him. But Vincent didn't have Marcello killed. That would have created martyrdom and possibly triggered a war with Marcello's crew. Instead, Vincent made him irrelevant. Marcello went from powerful captain to criminal pariah, arrested on multiple charges, abandoned by allies who didn't want to be associated with him. He would spend the next 3 years fighting legal battles that bankrupted him before finally going to prison. The message to everyone in Vincent's organization was clear. Loyalty was rewarded, but challenging Vincent's authority was destroyed, not through immediate violence, but through the systematic dismantling of everything you had built. It was a more sophisticated and more terrifying form of power than simple murder. By 1950, Vincent DeGrasso had been operating in the Pacific Northwest for 27 years. He was now 47 years old, wealthy beyond measure, powerful beyond most people's comprehension, and almost completely unknown outside the region. While Americans read about organized crime families in New York and Chicago, Vincent controlled an empire that stretched from the Canadian border to Northern California, that influenced governors and senators, that moved millions of dollars annually, and that had adapted to survive both Prohibition's end and World War II. He had become exactly what he set out to be at age 20, a man who made his own rules and took what he wanted. But he had done it more successfully than he could have imagined, creating an empire so sophisticated and well hidden that history would eventually forget he existed. The Forgotten Mobster was approaching his peak.
The next decade would test whether he could maintain power in a changing America, or whether the empire he built would finally attract the attention he had spent 3 decades avoiding. The 1950s began with Vincent DeGrasso at the absolute height of his power. But those same years would reveal that power, no matter how carefully built, eventually exacts its price. Vincent was now in his late 40s, living in a mansion that could have belonged to any successful businessman, with a wife who thought he was exactly that, and daughters being educated at the finest schools. His legitimate business holdings were worth millions.
His criminal empire generated profits that made those legitimate businesses look almost insignificant. Politicians throughout Oregon and Washington sought his approval. Union bosses answered his calls immediately, and law enforcement, despite suspicions, couldn't touch him. By every measure, Vincent had won. He had built exactly what he set out to build a generation earlier, an empire that operated in shadows so deep that most people didn't even know it existed. While Estes Kefauver's Senate hearings on organized crime were exposing mob activities in cities across America, Vincent's name never came up. While Frank Costello and other high-profile mobsters were called to testify before cameras, Vincent watched from Portland, completely anonymous, exactly as he preferred. But success breeds its own dangers. Vincent's very anonymity meant that federal authorities, when they finally started paying attention to the Pacific Northwest, didn't immediately understand what they were looking at. They saw isolated criminal activities, gambling operations here, union corruption there, political bribes in various cities, but they didn't see the connecting tissue. They didn't see that one man controlled all of it. That began changing in 1951, when a young FBI agent named Robert Morrison was transferred to the Portland office. Morrison was ambitious, smart, and he noticed patterns that previous agents had missed. He saw that certain lawyers represented multiple criminal operations.
He noticed that certain judges seemed unusually lenient toward specific defendants. He recognized that union strikes were being called strategically to benefit particular businesses, and he started wondering if someone was coordinating all of this. Morrison began building a case not against individual criminals, but against the organization he suspected existed. He couldn't prove Vincent's involvement yet. He didn't even know Vincent's name initially, but he knew there had to be someone at the center of this web. He started mapping connections, tracking money flows, and documenting relationships between seemingly unrelated people and businesses. For the first time in nearly 30 years, someone was looking at Vincent's empire from the right angle, and Vincent didn't realize it until Morrison had already gathered dangerous information. The investigation moved slowly. Morrison had to be careful because he suspected that Portland's police department was compromised, which meant he couldn't trust local law enforcement with sensitive information. He worked mostly alone, compiling evidence, following leads, and gradually building a picture of how organized crime operated in the Pacific Northwest. Vincent first became aware of Morrison in 1952, when one of his police contacts mentioned that an FBI agent was asking unusual questions about Vincent's legitimate businesses. This wasn't particularly alarming initially. Vincent had weathered FBI interest before, but something about Morrison's approach was different. He wasn't investigating specific crimes. He was investigating connections. Vincent had Morrison followed. He learned that the agent was young, unmarried, dedicated, and apparently incorruptible. Offering him bribes would be pointless and dangerous. Threatening him would bring down federal attention that could destroy Vincent's carefully maintained invisibility.
Vincent needed a different approach. He decided to use his political connections to have Morrison transferred. He reached out to a senator he had significant influence over and suggested that the FBI might better use Morrison's talents in other cities where organized crime was more significant than in the quiet Pacific Northwest. It should have worked. Vincent had used similar tactics successfully for years, but it didn't work this time. Morrison's superiors, perhaps recognizing his talent, or perhaps suspecting why someone wanted him transferred, kept him in Portland. For one of the first times in Vincent's criminal career, his political influence failed to solve a problem. This failure was significant. It meant the FBI was more independent than Vincent had realized. It meant his political protection had limits, and it meant Morrison was going to continue investigating. Vincent adapted his strategy. If he couldn't remove Morrison, he would make sure Morrison found nothing useful. Vincent increased the layers of insulation between himself and criminal operations. He communicated less directly with his captains. He avoided anything that could be documented or recorded. He became even more invisible than he had been for the previous 3 decades. But Vincent was also getting older, and with age came caution that bordered on paranoia. He began suspecting betrayal everywhere. When profits from Seattle operations declined, he suspected his captain was skimming more than usual. When a union deal fell through, he suspected someone had been bribed away from him. When Morrison seemed to get information too quickly, Vincent suspected someone in his organization was talking. This paranoia led Vincent to make decisions that would eventually fracture his empire. He demoted captains he suspected of disloyalty without solid evidence. He cut percentages to operators he thought were holding back money.
He became less the benevolent boss who made everyone prosperous, and more the suspicious tyrant looking for betrayal around every corner. The men in his organization noticed this change. Vincent had ruled for decades through a careful balance of reward and fear. Now the balance was tipping toward fear, and men who feel afraid start thinking about alternatives. In 1953, Vincent's paranoia reached new heights when one of his most trusted captains, a man named Sal Fazio, who had been with him since the early Portland days, died suddenly of a heart attack. Fazio had handled much of Vincent's union operations, and his death created both a practical problem, who would replace him, and a psychological one. Fazio had been one of the few people who remembered the early years, who understood how the empire had been built. His death was a reminder that Vincent's generation was aging, that the world they had known was passing. Vincent became obsessed with legacy. He was in his 50s now, wealthy beyond measure, but increasingly isolated. His daughters were grown and married, his relationship with them formal and distant because he could never be honest about his life. Catherine, his wife, was developing health problems and spending more time with doctors than with him. The organization that had been his life's work felt more like a burden than an achievement. He began thinking about succession. Who could take over when he retired or died? His daughters couldn't inherit a criminal empire they didn't know existed. None of his captains had the intelligence and patience to maintain what Vincent had built. The organization would likely fracture after his death, pieces going to various lieutenants who would immediately start fighting each other. Vincent realized that he had built something that couldn't outlast him. The empire was him.
Without Vincent at the center, coordinating everything, corrupting the right people, applying pressure and rewards with perfect timing, the whole system would collapse. This realization was both liberating and depressing. Liberating because it meant Vincent didn't have to worry about succession. Depressing because it meant 3 decades of work would disappear when he did. Meanwhile, Morrison's investigation continued to progress. By 1955, he had documented connections between dozens of criminal operations throughout Oregon and Washington. He had evidence of union corruption, illegal gambling, political bribery, and money laundering. What he still couldn't do was connect any of it definitively to Vincent DeGrasso. Morrison knew Vincent was involved. Every line of investigation eventually pointed toward Vincent's legitimate businesses or his known associates. But knowing and proving were different things. Vincent had been so careful for so long that there was no smoking gun, No direct evidence, nothing that would survive a courtroom. Frustrated, Morrison began trying a different approach. He started pressuring Vincent's subordinates, arresting low-level operators, offering deals to middle management, trying to flip someone who would testify against Vincent. But Vincent's organization had been built on loyalty, enforced by prosperity and fear. No one talked. Everyone knew that testifying against Vincent meant either prison time for perjury when he was proven innocent, or something worse if you disappeared before trial. The years 1955 to 1957 became a war of attrition between Morrison's investigation and Vincent's organization. Morrison would arrest someone, charges would be dismissed on technicalities, or evidence would disappear. Morrison would find a witness. The witness would recant or refuse to testify. Morrison would subpoena records. Fires would destroy those records before they could be reviewed. Vincent was winning this war, but it was costing him.
Legal fees were enormous. Maintaining the corruption network necessary to protect his operations required ever-increasing bribes. The constant pressure was exhausting, and the stress was taking a physical toll. Vincent developed ulcers. His blood pressure was dangerously high. His doctor warned him that he needed to reduce stress or risk a heart attack. In 1958, Catherine, Vincent's wife of 26 years, died of cancer. They had been distant for years, living essentially separate lives under the same roof, but her death still hit Vincent hard. She had been a connection to normalcy, to the legitimate life he pretended to live. Without her, Vincent's double life became harder to maintain. His daughters, now in their 20s and married to respectable men with no idea about their father-in-law's real business, came to Portland for the funeral. Vincent looked at them and realized they were strangers to him. He had protected them from his criminal life so successfully that he had no relationship with them. They knew Vincent DeGrasso, businessman, a role he had performed for them their entire lives, but they didn't know him. After Catherine's funeral, Vincent stood alone in his mansion and confronted a truth he had been avoiding. He had everything he had ever wanted materially, and he was profoundly alone. The empire he built had required him to trust no one completely, to keep everyone at a distance, to never be truly honest with anyone about who he really was. His wife had died not knowing her husband. His children didn't know their father. His associates feared and respected him, but didn't love him. Vincent DeGrasso had won every battle over 3.5 decades. He had built an empire from nothing. He had outsmarted competitors, corrupted systems, survived law enforcement, and accumulated wealth beyond imagination. But in winning, he had lost something essential. He had become powerful, but profoundly isolated. He had everything, and he had nothing.
The year 1959 found Vincent DeGrasso at a crossroads he never expected to face. At 56 years old, he looked at least a decade older. The stress of maintaining an empire while fighting federal investigation had carved lines into his face and turned his hair completely gray. He still lived in his West Hills mansion, but now it felt more like a mausoleum than a home, filled with expensive furniture and haunting silence. Morrison's investigation had reached a stalemate. The FBI agent had amassed thousands of pages of evidence documenting criminal operations throughout the Northwest, but he still couldn't definitively connect them to Vincent. Every trail led to intermediaries, to legitimate businesses with ambiguous purposes, to relationships that could be explained away as normal business dealings. Morrison knew he was looking at a criminal mastermind, but Vincent had built his empire too cleverly to be easily destroyed. Vincent, for his part, was tired. 3 decades of constant vigilance were taking their toll. Every phone call could be monitored. Every meeting could be observed. Every decision had to be analyzed for potential evidence it might create. The paranoia that had always been a useful tool now felt overwhelming. Vincent found himself suspecting everyone, trusting no one, and questioning whether any of it had been worth it. His criminal empire was still profitable, still powerful, but it was also increasingly vulnerable. The world was changing in ways that threatened old-style organized crime. Federal law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated. Wiretapping technology was improving. The FBI and IRS were coordinating investigations. And a new generation of criminals was emerging who didn't respect the old ways of doing business. Vincent faced challenges from within his organization as well. Younger captains who hadn't built the empire from nothing were questioning why they should give Vincent such large percentages.
They saw an aging boss who spent more time protecting himself than expanding operations. They wanted more autonomy, more profits, more respect. One captain in particular became increasingly problematic. Dominic Russo, Vincent's nephew by marriage, who ran operations in Eugene. Russo was capable and ambitious, but he was also reckless in ways Vincent had never been. He wanted to expand into drug trafficking, specifically heroin, which was becoming enormously profitable in the late 1950s. Vincent absolutely refused. He had avoided drugs his entire career. Drugs drew federal attention like nothing else. Drugs created addicts who became unreliable and visible problems. Drugs offended Vincent on a moral level he couldn't quite articulate. Drugs destroyed communities in ways that gambling and even prostitution didn't. His empire had been built on vices that consenting adults chose. Drugs were different. Russo argued that they were leaving millions of dollars on the table. Other organizations were making fortunes from heroin. The demand was enormous. They had the distribution networks already in place. It would be easy money. Vincent said no, and made it clear the subject wasn't open for discussion. This was his organization, his rules, and they would not traffic in drugs. Russo accepted this publicly, but privately began making his own plans. If Vincent wouldn't let him sell drugs through the organization, Russo would do it independently. He began building relationships with Mexican suppliers. He started moving small amounts of heroin through Eugene, using dealers who weren't part of Vincent's operation. He was careful, or so he thought, to keep these activities hidden from Vincent. But Vincent's intelligence network, built over decades, was too thorough. He learned about Russo's drug operation within weeks of its starting.
This betrayal, Russo directly violating Vincent's explicit orders, couldn't be ignored without destroying Vincent's authority over the entire organization. In early 1960, Vincent called a meeting with his top captains. Russo attended, not knowing his activities had been discovered. Vincent laid out everything: Russo's drug operation, his Mexican connections, his secret dealers, his profits. Then Vincent asked Russo a simple question: did I or did I not specifically forbid this? Russo tried to defend himself. He argued that Vincent was being old-fashioned, that drug money was too valuable to ignore, that the organization needed to evolve. He made the fatal mistake of suggesting that if Vincent wouldn't adapt, maybe Vincent shouldn't be in charge anymore. The room went silent. Every captain present understood that Russo had just challenged Vincent's authority directly. This couldn't end well. Vincent remained calm. He explained to everyone that the organization worked because there were rules, and the most important rule was that his word was final.
Anyone who couldn't accept that was welcome to leave, but if you stayed, you followed orders. Russo had broken this fundamental rule, and there had to be consequences. Vincent gave Russo a choice: shut down the drug operation completely, turn over all profits to the organization as a fine, and accept demotion to a minor role, or leave the organization entirely, which meant leaving Oregon and giving up all territory. It was humiliating, but not fatal. Vincent was still offering Russo a way out that didn't involve death. Many bosses would have simply had Russo killed for such direct disobedience, but Vincent had always preferred to avoid violence when possible. Dead bodies drew attention and created martyrs. Russo made a terrible decision. He refused both options.
He argued that he had earned his position, that he wasn't going to let Vincent destroy what he'd built, that other captains should recognize Vincent was past his prime. Russo was essentially trying to stage a revolt, appealing to other captains to join him in pushing Vincent aside. No one supported Russo. The other captains had watched Vincent operate for decades. They knew he was still sharp, still dangerous, and still capable of destroying anyone who challenged him. They also remembered what happened to Tony Marcello and others who had questioned Vincent's authority. Loyalty to Vincent might be costly, but disloyalty was fatal. Vincent looked at Russo with genuine sadness. This was family, his dead wife's nephew, someone Vincent had elevated and enriched, and now he had to destroy him. Within a week, federal agents received detailed information about Russo's drug operation. Eugene police raided his stash houses, his dealers were arrested, his Mexican suppliers cut ties to avoid being exposed, and Russo himself was arrested on trafficking charges, with evidence so overwhelming that no amount of corruption could make the case disappear. Russo would spend the next 20 years in federal prison. His organization was dismantled, his family was disgraced, and every captain in Vincent's empire received a clear message: the old boss was still capable of destroying anyone who challenged him. But this victory was hollow. Vincent took no pleasure in destroying Russo. He felt only weariness and a deepening sense that he was fighting losing battles. The world was changing, his organization was becoming harder to control, and he was getting older and more tired. In 1961, Vincent made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a decade earlier. He began planning his exit. He started gradually reducing his involvement in criminal operations. He promoted loyal captains to handle more day-to-day decisions.
He focused on his legitimate businesses, which were substantial enough to provide comfortable income without criminal activity. He began transforming from active crime boss to semi-retired elder statesman of the Northwest Underworld. This transition wasn't announced publicly, but everyone in the organization understood what was happening. Vincent was stepping back. The empire he had built for 38 years was being allowed to fragment in controlled fashion. Captains who had operated under Vincent's authority were becoming more independent. The careful coordination that had characterized Vincent's rule was loosening. Morrison, the FBI agent who had pursued Vincent for over a decade, recognized what was happening. Vincent was making himself less vulnerable by making himself less central. It was a brilliant defensive move, but it also meant Morrison's chances of building a case against Vincent were disappearing. If Vincent retired before Morrison could prove his criminal activities, the forgotten mobster would remain forgotten. His empire dissolved, but his personal freedom maintained. By 1963, Vincent was essentially retired. He still owned his legitimate businesses. He still had relationships with political figures.
he still received a percentage from some operations out of respect for what he had built, but he was no longer actively controlling criminal operations in Oregon and Washington. The empire he had built didn't survive his retirement intact. Without Vincent coordinating everything, competing interests fractured the organization. Former captains became independent operators. Some failed and disappeared. Some succeeded and built their own smaller operations. A few were arrested without Vincent's protection network shielding them. The vast, sophisticated criminal empire that Vincent had maintained for decades broke into pieces. Morrison finally gave up his investigation in 1964.
He had spent 13 years trying to build a case against Vincent DeGrasso and had nothing to show for it. His superiors decided it was time to focus on other priorities. Morrison was transferred to Seattle and then eventually to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. He would have a successful career, but he always considered Vincent DeGrasso the one that got away. Vincent spent his remaining years living quietly in Portland. He maintained his legitimate businesses, attended church, made charitable donations, and presented himself as simply a retired businessman. The few people who knew his criminal history kept silent, either out of loyalty, fear, or self-interest. In 1970, Vincent suffered a severe heart attack. He survived, but was left weakened and frail. His doctor told him he had damaged his heart too severely and that another attack was likely. Vincent spent the next 2 years mostly at home, occasionally seeing old associates who visited to pay respects, but largely isolated. On a rainy November evening in 1972, Vincent DeGrasso died in his sleep. He was 69 years old. His obituary in the Portland newspaper described him as a successful businessman and community philanthropist. There was no mention of criminal activities, no hint of the empire he had built and ruled for nearly 4 decades. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, legitimate businessmen, politicians, union leaders, a few elderly men who had been part of his organization, and people who genuinely thought they were mourning a respectable community figure. 2 FBI agents attended as well, watching to see who would come, taking photographs of attendees, still looking for evidence about an empire that no longer existed. Vincent DeGrasso was buried in Portland's Riverview Cemetery, his grave marked with a simple headstone that gave no indication that beneath it lay one of the most successful and least known criminals in American history.
Vincent DeGrasso's story didn't end with his death. It ended with his complete erasure from public consciousness, a final victory of the invisibility he had cultivated his entire criminal career. In the years after Vincent died, researchers began documenting organized crime history in America. They wrote extensively about the Italian mob families in New York, the Chicago outfit, the Philadelphia mob, and crime syndicates in cities across the country. But the Pacific Northwest barely appeared in these histories. When Oregon and Washington were mentioned at all, it was as regions with minimal organized crime influence. This wasn't because Vincent's empire had been insignificant. At its peak in the 1940s and 1950s, Vincent controlled criminal operations that generated profits comparable to any mob family in America. He had more political influence in Oregon and Washington than most East Coast mobsters had in their cities. His organization employed hundreds and affected thousands of lives. But Vincent had been so careful, so determined to avoid publicity, so successful at insulating himself from direct evidence, that when he retired and his empire fragmented, there was almost no paper trail for historians to follow. Police files mentioned various criminal operations but rarely connected them to a single organization.
FBI reports documented individual cases but missed the larger pattern. Newspaper articles cover occasional gambling raids or political corruption scandals without recognizing they were pieces of a larger empire. Vincent had achieved what every criminal dreams of, and almost none accomplish. He got away with it completely. He made millions of dollars, controlled an entire region, lived a comfortable life, and died a free man with his reputation mostly intact. And then he was forgotten, which is exactly what he would have wanted. But Vincent's legacy lived on in ways he might not have anticipated.
The corruption networks he built in Oregon and Washington politics didn't disappear when he retired. The relationships between unions and organized crime that he pioneered continued. The model of operating criminal enterprises through legitimate business fronts became standard practice for modern organized crime. Several of Vincent's former captains went on to build their own operations using methods they learned from him. They understood the value of invisibility, the importance of corrupting officials, the effectiveness of making people prosperous rather than just afraid. Vincent's influence spread through generations of criminals who learned from his example, even if they never knew his name. His legitimate businesses continued for decades after his death. The restaurants he owned were sold and resold. The hotels became part of larger chains. The import-export companies were absorbed by competitors. His investments in Portland real estate appreciated enormously over the years. Vincent's daughters, who had inherited what they believed was simply a successful business portfolio, became wealthy women who never understood that their comfortable lives were originally funded by criminal enterprise. One of the few people who understood Vincent's true significance was Robert Morrison, the FBI agent who had pursued him for 13 years. After Morrison retired from the Bureau in 1978, he spent several years trying to write a book about Vincent DeGrasso and the forgotten Pacific Northwest crime empire. He had kept extensive notes from his investigation. He interviewed former associates who were willing to talk after Vincent was dead. He documented the scope of Vincent's operations and the sophisticated methods he used. But Morrison could never find a publisher. Editors told him the story wasn't compelling enough. Vincent wasn't famous like Capone or Gotti. There were no dramatic shootouts, no famous murders, no sensational trials.
Vincent's story was one of quiet, methodical control rather than flashy criminal spectacle. In the entertainment-driven crime-writing market, Vincent DeGrasso was too boring to be interesting. Morrison's manuscript remained unpublished. When he died in 1995, his papers were donated to the FBI's Historical Archive, where they sit largely unexamined. Vincent's story was documented but unread, preserved but forgotten. The few journalists and historians who did encounter evidence of Vincent's empire tended to dismiss it as exaggerated. A single criminal controlling that much territory for that long without being caught seemed implausible. They assumed informants were inflating someone's importance, or that Vincent had been a minor figure whose role was being exaggerated by people who had known him. This skepticism was ironic. Vincent had spent his entire career making his power seem implausible, operating in ways that made people doubt he could be that important. Even after his death, his greatest skill, invisibility, protected his reputation and allowed him to remain forgotten. Today, nearly 60 years after Vincent's retirement, and over 50 years after his death, almost no one remembers Vincent DeGrasso. Portland and Seattle have changed beyond recognition. The neighborhoods where he operated have been gentrified. The buildings where he held court have been demolished or repurposed. The politicians he corrupted are long dead. The unions he controlled have transformed. The businesses he used as fronts have closed or changed hands so many times that their origins are forgotten. If you walk through Portland's West Hills today, you can pass the location where Vincent's mansion once stood. It was torn down in the 1980s and replaced with modern condominiums. Nothing marks the site. No historical plaque commemorates that here lived one of the most successful criminals in American history.
Because how do you commemorate someone who succeeded by being forgotten? Vincent DeGrasso's story raises uncomfortable questions about American history and crime. We remember the flashy gangsters, the violent ones, the ones who made headlines and became legends. But the most successful criminals are the ones we don't remember. The ones who built empires quietly, corrupted systems efficiently, and avoided prosecution completely. Vincent proved that real power doesn't announce itself. Real power whispers and operates in shadows. Real power makes itself seem implausible, so that even when exposed, people don't believe it existed. In the end, Vincent DeGrasso got exactly what he wanted. He lived the American dream, just the criminal version of it. He came to America with nothing and built an empire. He made himself wealthy and powerful. He influenced politicians and controlled entire industries. He raised daughters who lived comfortable, respectable lives. And when he died, he was buried as a respectable businessman, while the empire he built dissolved into history, leaving almost no trace. The Forgotten Mobster achieved the ultimate criminal success. He committed thousands of crimes over 4 decades, made millions of dollars, controlled an entire region, and got away with all of it. Not just legally, but historically. He wasn't caught, and he wasn't remembered. And perhaps that's the most frightening legacy of Vincent DeGrasso. Not what he did, but how effectively he erased evidence that he had done it. How completely he vanished into the shadows he had always inhabited. How thoroughly he won by being forgotten. Somewhere in Portland's Riverview Cemetery, under a simple headstone marking an apparently ordinary grave, lies a man who mastered organized crime more completely than almost anyone in American history, and almost no one knows he's there. That's power. That's victory.
That's the final triumph of Oregon's forgotten mobster. Vincent DeGrasso built an empire and left no trace. And that's the story of Vincent DeGrasso, the mobster America forgot. A man who controlled the Pacific Northwest's criminal underworld for nearly 40 years and then vanished from history as completely as if he never existed. While we remember Al Capone and Lucky Luciano, John Gotti and Frank Costello, the names that filled headlines and became legends, we forget that the most successful criminals are the ones whose names we never learned. Vincent understood something profound about power. Real control doesn't need recognition. Real power operates in shadows where history can't follow. He proved that you could build an empire, influence governors and senators, control unions and businesses, make millions of dollars, and then simply disappear, leaving barely a trace for historians to find. If this story of forgotten history fascinated you, if you want to dive deeper into the criminals and stories that textbooks deliberately left out, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now.
because we are going to keep uncovering these forgotten chapters, these ghost stories of American crime that deserve to be remembered, even if the criminals themselves wanted to be forgotten. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Vincent DeGrasso was more successful than the famous mobsters precisely because he stayed unknown? Is being forgotten the ultimate criminal success? And what other forgotten criminals should we investigate next? I read every comment, and your suggestions often become our next deep dive into history's shadows. If you enjoyed this journey into Oregon's secret criminal history, give this video a thumbs up. Share it with anyone who loves true crime stories that go beyond the same old faces we always hear about.
And check out the description below for sources and additional reading about Pacific Northwest organized crime. Because while Vincent DeGrasso is forgotten, pieces of his story still exist if you know where to look. Remember, history is written by those who are remembered, but the most interesting stories often belong to those who chose to be forgotten. Vincent DeGrasso was one of those stories, and now, at least for a moment, we've remembered. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows where the real history hides.